Hey, Redheads and everyone else listening, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Adrienne, and today's episode, Steph, by far, best episode we've ever done.
Coolest
or it's gonna
one.
Be.
Yes, we're getting down to the nitty gritty.
We want to know.
Yeah. Do redheads feel more pain, less pain? What's our pain threshold? Is it high? Is it low? It's so confusing, Adrienne.
It's so confusing. There's so many websites out there that are saying that redheads feel more pain because I think that they're reading that redheads have a higher pain threshold. So
right.
That does not mean that redheads feel more pain because they have a higher threshold. That would actually mean they have less pain. So we have heard just so many conflicting things. And to be honest with you, when you read these studies, I mean, they're very scientific, very
especially the one that just came out.
Right. So that's what we're getting down to the bottom of. So the guy who did the study, his name is Dr. David E. Fisher. He's an MD, a PhD, and he recently just did a study at Mass General Hospital in Massachusetts. And the findings were published in Science Advances. We featured it on howtobearedhead.com, and then we immediately reached out to him and said, hey, we'd love to have you on the podcast to just fix any misinformation out on the web about redheads and their pain threshold, right?
Right.
So here we are we're going to call him in a few minutes. We're super excited. We've been prepping for this because this is not a typical beauty podcast, right?
No, it's very scientific.
It's very scientific, and he is the lead guy. He has been doing the studies. He is extremely intelligent, brilliant man who has done all of these studies about red-haired individuals and how their pigment or how their genes is traced to feeling more pain or feeling less pain. So we're going to ask him point blank 101, what do redheads feel, less pain or more pain? We are super excited about having him on the podcast. Again, he's Dr. David E. Fisher. He's an MD, PhD. He's internationally known as a researcher, clinician, academic, who is the chief of the Massachusetts General Hospital Department of Dermatology at Harvard Medical School in Boston. He also serves as a director of the Mass General Hospital Cutaneous Biology Research Center and director of the Melanoma Center at Mass General Hospital. So he's a professor of dermatology and of pediatrics at Harvard Med School. Dr. Fisher came to Mass General from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where he previously directed the melanoma program. So, wow, this is the guy to talk to about if redheads feel more pain or not, right?
Yeah, and hopefully we can also get down to his studies that he's done in the past too on melanoma. And we'll touch upon that. But this episode,
we have so much to talk about though with pain.
I feel like but
that might have to be a part too.
Yep, and this, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say that this podcast episode is really about pain because it's definitely it's confusing. And when we shared that article, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks ago when the study came out, Adrienne and I just kind of summarized and took, some from the study that was featured online from Science Advances. But when we shared it, especially on Facebook, Adrienne, I don't know if you saw all the comments, there were a lot of questions. People were saying, okay, does this mean that I have a higher pain tolerance, a lower pain tolerance? Does that mean I can handle more pain? People are just very confused.
It's confusing.
And I'm not surprised, too. A lot of these headlines from some of these other outlets, like I think News Weekly or some big outlet, their title for the article when I was doing research, Adrienne, before this podcast was so confusing.
No, I know it is. And I think honestly, from reading the articles, people are confused who's writing it because they're not scientists and it is technical. Another thing about Dr. Fisher is his training, just so you know how great this information is going to be from him. His training is in medicine, pediatrics, and oncology, and was carried out at Harvard Medical School. And he recently served for 3 years as president of the Society for Melanoma Research.
And the Society for Melanoma Research, it is the largest international society dedicated to the study of melanoma. So it's the largest. Yeah. So, and he was the president. So
yeah,
I know.
This is the guy.
Yeah.
This is the guy.
Yeah. So let's call him up.
Hi, Dr. Fisher. This is Adrienne and Stephanie with the How to Be a Redhead podcast.
Hi. Good to be here.
It's so great to be here. Thank you for joining us. We are so excited because there's been a lot of confusion on social media. So we wanted to get to the bottom of it. In very simple terms, can you break down what you do, what you focus on, and the new research that you came out with surrounding the MC1R gene? We basically want to know if redheads feel more pain or less pain.
Yeah.
Sure. So we have actually a fairly long history of interest in studying the science of the MC1R gene and its role in pigmentation and in cancer risk and in risk associated to ultraviolet radiation, skin health. And then more recently, we became interested in the connections that actually were historical connections that we read about involving correlations between the MC1R variants that are associated with red hair and altered pain thresholds. And so that led us to move into an area that is not our routine area of focus, and rather start studying pain thresholds and what is the influence of the MC1R gene in that. And so the way that we approached this was to utilize mice. We used animals, laboratory animals, for the study. And the reason for doing the animal studies rather than human studies is, firstly, a lot of the human studies had been done previously, so that we knew what we were going to be trying to correlate, had a correlation in humans, although in humans, for reasons I'll get to in just a second, it's much more complex. Whereas in the mouse, we have a much simpler, more experimental control over the nature of the experiment. And the reason for that is that the mice that we study are genetically they're genetically back-crossed, which is to say that in a sense, the entire strain of mice, they're all like identical twins. Their genomes, their genetics is all what we call inbred. And so the strain of mice that we were studying, all the mice are genetically identical to each other. And so when we had mice with black fur and we compared them with mice that had red fur, the only genetic difference we know of, and it's conceivable that there are very rare genetic events that could happen beyond our level of detection. But for practical purposes, the only genetic variable in that experiment is the MC1R gene. And the red hair mouse being a really pretty beautiful model genetically of red hair in people. And so these are literally rusty colored mice. And again, we've primarily used these for studies of skin biology, skin health, cancer, things of that nature. And when we had these mice, and I should say before I go on, in contrast to this experimental setting in mice that are genetically defined like this, humans just simply aren't that way. Humans are extremely outbred. So, the relationship, even the genetic relationship between, let's say, two siblings is statistically about 25% identical if they have the same parents. The two parents have typically almost nothing in common with it, unless their parents were related in some fashion. So human populations are enormously outbred. And if you take two random redheaded people from off the street, the odds are that in addition to their red hair that they share, the remaining 25,000 genes or so in the genome, could be randomly distributed among many different variants. And so it is genetically extremely complicated to correlate a phenotype or a behavioral trait, let's say in this case a pain threshold, to the red hair state in humans. And the way that scientists get around that is by studying many people, so that you hope that the only thing that your trait is segregating with is the hair color, but technically you don't know. There could be some hidden other genetic thing going on inside the body that is actually explaining let's say, a pain threshold in that case. So I'm not going to dig too deep into this, but simply to say that the laboratory mouse has the advantage of what is considered to be a much simpler and understandable genetic background. And so if we compare black fur versus red fur in these strains, we are confident that it is the MC1R gene that is really behind that difference. There's no other known difference, and these are genetically defined. And so the first thing we did in this study was to compare pain thresholds, and we actually compared two different types of thresholds. But I have to, before I go into this, mention for a minute, what do we mean? What is a pain threshold? What is a pain threshold, and what is pain, and what is pain relief? Because these are all very related, but actually pretty different concepts. And it's very important. I work in a department of dermatology at a hospital, Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard Medical School here in Boston. And I can tell you that our faculty, as well as anesthesiologists, surgeons, people who are in a situation where sometimes, there may be a procedure that is involving patients and maybe pain medicines would be needed, things of that nature. And they would all tell us, well, people with red hair walk into the room, I'm probably going to need more powerful pain medicine to give them pain relief, or what we call analgesic relief, so that they can avoid feeling pain. That is a very different thing from what is the pain threshold. So when we measured pain we didn't study analgesia. We didn't study relief from pain. We studied just the limit of where something is such a fine touch to where it can even be perceived as potentially what we would call pain. And the two types we measured were a pressure. So this is like taking a filament like a hair, something extremely delicate, and poking the foot of the mouse through the bottom of the cage. And they don't typically feel it because it's so flexible. Then we take a slightly stiffer one and we poke it a few times. And we use these braided filaments until we just notice that after we poke it, the mouse lifts up its foot and licks it. That's what we call that the threshold. That is the thickness, that's a pressure threshold where they just sense that they want to lick their toe, something, they perceive something. And that is a pressure threshold. And the other threshold that we measured was temperature threshold. And in this case, we put mice on a little plate that's kind of warm. It's a little bit warmer than we would all be comfortable standing on or sitting on, something like that. And the same with the mice. But what we do is it's not extremely hot. So they will sit on there and we will set a stopwatch and count the seconds. We will count the time until they jump. And their sensation, or their ability to perceive what we call a thermal threshold, thermal nociceptive threshold, a temperature-related threshold, is related to how long it takes before they perceive that and then they jump. And that also turns out to be a very sensitive way to measure. And you can quantify all these things. You can get statistical analyses. And when we did this in black mice versus red mice, we found reproducibly and similarly for both forms of sensation that the red-haired mice actually were more tolerant. That is to say, it took a stiffer poke or a longer time on the high temperature hot plate before they would lift their leg or jump. And we could even do this experiment with making the mice blinded. I should say making the experiment blinded to the person who ran it by adding another gene that made all the mice white. So we could have the mice. So the MC1R gene encodes a protein on the surface of pigment cells. And when it functions strongly, the pigment is dark. And when the MC1R gene protein is not functioning, the pigment is red. But the actual pathway that actually produces the pigment, the melanin, within the melanocyte, within the pigment cell, requires several enzymes. And if we disabled one of those enzymes through another genetic trick in this strain of animals, we now had mice that were albinos, which were white. However, they could be albino but still genetically red or genetically black, which allowed us to have the mice look white And therefore, the experimenter who was testing pain thresholds couldn't tell if they were genetically red or genetically black. They would just do a blinded experiment and measure the pain thresholds without knowing. And then afterwards, we could sort of deconvolute the data. And even in that setting, the genetically red mice had this higher pain threshold, and the genetically black mice had the lower pain threshold, so that it was blinded. It was kind of a level of stringency to the test. And so that's the fundamental observation. And what we really then analyzed in much more detail was the mechanism that was responsible for this. How is it that something that's so seemingly unrelated as color of hair could impact the ability to sense pain? Where is this coming from? And I'll spare you the details of the many, many experiments that were used. I can mention there were a combination of altering some of the genes using kind of genetic engineered models, and using drugs that could either stimulate or block certain very specific pathways within the cells and in the nervous system that perceives pain. What it actually told us is several things. Number one is that the pigment cells, somewhat surprisingly, are actually secreting factors that have the ability to modulate pain. And right off the bat, that was sort of a surprising thing. I mean, who would ever expect that pigment cells have the capacity to make things that float around the bloodstream go into the brain and actually temper the ability to sense pain. But that is exactly what we found. For example, we had a strain of mice that genetically had no pigment cells. And those mice, like the red-haired mice, actually had higher pain thresholds as well. And again, because these mice have a very known genetic background, these were not really ambiguous experiments like they would more likely be in a human population, because there were just individual genes being varied from experiment to experiment. And so in a little bit more detail, what we found is that the effect of having the MC1R red hair variant, which is a lower functioning version of the receptor, the protein that MC1R encodes, is causing the secreted factors that affect pain threshold end up having a different proportion of signals that protect against pain, anti-pain, opiate-like signals, versus the opposite side of this kind of seesaw, pro-pain types of signals that increase a sensitivity to pain. And it turns out that the pigment cells secrete factors that have the capacity to affect both sides of that balance. There are factors that can increase sensitivity to pain and decrease sensitivity to pain. Both of them are decreased in the red hair background, but when they are decreased equivalently in the red-haired background on both sides of the seesaw, it turns out that has the net effect of tipping the balance in favor of the anti-pain side of the seesaw, because there are other sources of anti-pain molecules and signals in the body coming from non-pigment cells. And those sources have not been changed. In redheads versus non-redheads, those other sources, there's no impact. And therefore, the contribution of melanocytes is very small to the anti-pain total signal, but is proportionally much higher to the signals that are enhancing sensitivity, the pro-pain signals on the opposite side. So again, sorry for a lot of detail around this.
No, love it.
Basically, what we're seeing is, firstly, that pigment cells in the body, in fact, do make factors that modulate the threshold or the sensitivity to pain to multiple forms, both, as I mentioned, pressure and temperature. We don't know that would be true to every other type of pain. There are other forms of pain. But at least for these two, which we think are quite representative, we do see that. And secondly, that the mechanism behind it is quite intricate, and actually opens up some, we think, interesting aspects of how pain is generally regulated within the body, and maybe down the line could even generate new types of pain relief medicines on the basis of understanding this. But I do want to mention one other very important point, because I started this whole point out, this little explanation out a few minutes ago, by pointing out that the clinicians here will tell you that people with red hair will say, I need more pain medicine, as though I'm more sensitive to pain. But I just told you that our studies actually showed the opposite. Our studies showed that you're less sensitive to pain. And so we have thought enormously about this. What does this mean? I mean, this almost seems to be contradictory. But it's actually interesting and we think actually very important. So the first point is that sensitivity to pain of the type that we measured is just identifying that limit where you just begin to sense pain. When pain is so mild, but you just pick it out. What is that threshold? But that is very different from what does it take to give me relief from pain? What does it take if I walk in and I have pain, or if somebody is going to make a scrape in my skin? How much morphine, how much benzocaine, how much whatever the medicine that would be used as a pain reliever would it take to reverse that pain, to produce analgesia? That's actually a very, very different endpoint. And that tends to be the endpoint that a lot of patients feel. They're not necessarily going around saying, I just touched this very gently and, I didn't really think it was painful. Did you think that was painful? That tends not to be as much what the conversation is, but people do remember if there was something where they felt pain and it just wouldn't go away, and they took pain medicine, it still wasn't going away, or, the doctor was having to inject more and more numbing medicine. That is the scenario which seems to be backwards, but actually is not backwards. I think it's just different.
Yeah.
And there are potential reasons of why it might be different. I cannot say that we studied that in this particular study, but there's some interesting hypotheses of why that would be. But the last thing I want to say about this is that I think the very fact that we see a clear difference in the threshold and just the limit of pain sensing demonstrates in a genetically clean way, using these laboratory animals, that this is a real thing, that the pain threshold differences that were identified, this is not in some people's minds, or, an old wives' tale or something that maybe it's real, maybe it's not real. This is in a genetically blinded, very rigorous type of a study, suggests that this is something that is really encoded in our genomes. We've evolved to have this. It's even true in mice. There was evidence that this was true in humans, and I think now in mice being corroborated with more genetic power to the studies, I think demonstrates that. And I think what it also means is, for a clinician, even in the setting of pain relief, which is not exactly what was studied here, the concerns that there are differences that red-haired people would often verbalize are real ones, and almost certainly need to be taken very seriously. And I think it will be really interesting to understand mechanistically, why is it that it takes more pain medicine to control the pain in the red-haired backgrounds.
Wow. Okay. So that answered so much. I have all these notes I've been writing down. So redheads do feel less pain. That's what the studies show. But of course, people are more concerned about what pain medicines to use to relieve that pain. And that's kind of why the dialogue is getting confused by, like, if redheads feel more pain or they feel less pain, because they're really not understanding. They're more thinking about how to get rid of the pain than they are thinking about, like, the origin of the pain.
Exactly.
Okay.
In other words, they're not measuring just the limit. How sensitive are they to developing pain in the first place? They're thinking, how quickly can I get rid of it?
Right.
As I would too, as everybody does.
Right.
You're not really thinking, will I have pain today? As much as, can I tune it down so I barely have pain? It's more, I need this procedure done. I'm going to have a tooth pulled, or I'm going to have a baby, or there's things that are kind of painful out there. The question that most people have appropriately is can you please control this, doctor? And the doctor will say, I need more pain medicine to control it. And this is universally agreed upon by physicians that is true. And I would actually give you a proposed mechanism of why this would be, because if you have a perpetually different pain threshold on the basis of hair color, that probably is tuning the pathway and altering the sensitivity to pain medicines in a way that's going to be different. Wow. And, that without going into a whole lot of detail about it, biology is filled with examples like that. If you one way to think about it is like you use a pain medicine over and over and over and over, and it may not work as well the 10th time or the 20th time. And so in a sense, the pain, the pathways that are tempering the perception of pain are being chronically stimulated at different levels, at different set points. So in my thinking about this, I'm actually not surprised that there would be a difference, and I'm not even that surprised that it would seem backwards, that redheads wouldn't have the ability to respond as well to opiate type pain medicines. And I think there are physicians who will even say different categories of pain medicines are more likely to be efficacious in people with red hair as opposed to non-red hair. But I think a lot of research could be helpful there, and then hopefully simply provide the pain relief that these individuals want and deserve to have.
Right. And so if I heard you right too, the reason for the anti-pain and why it's so strong in redheads, specifically in the red-haired mice, is because of two things, because of the MC1R gene and because of the pigment cells. So those two things make it so that redheads really feel the anti-pain. Is that true? Did I get that right?
I'm not sure what you mean by feel the anti-pain.
Sorry.
Oh, why are they receiving an anti-pain signal?
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
In a way, that's right. Yes. So the MC1R gene, which is its protein, is made in pigment cells. But it is it's the signals that the pigment cell sends out that are resulting in a different balance between anti-pain and pro-pain signals. But that's right. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So another question too is a lot of people were asking this on our Facebook page. So I just wanted to bring it to the attention, but they want to know why mice are chosen and there's not human studies.
Yeah. So really important. I mean, really, who cares about pain thresholds in mice? Absolutely. I couldn't agree more as a physician myself. So two things I would say. Number one, and I've alluded to some of this before. Number one, a lot of the evidence supporting this was already published in humans. And over 10, 20 years ago already, where people had done like very light touch and temperature sensation, things of that nature. So there had been some studies already that had proposed that in humans, having red hair also would make these individuals less sensitive to that threshold of pain, that limiting minimum threshold for sensing pain. And so it was very important for us to be sure that what we saw in the mice matched those data, and it did. And that's what we did before we then went on to study the mechanism in mice, because otherwise, what do we care? Maybe mice are just different. But right. The pattern we saw matched what had previously been seen in humans. So that was the first part of this. And the second reason that mice were chosen for this rather than humans is that in mice, we have this clean genetic background where we can have literally one gene varied between two mice that we're comparing to each other. One gene is different, but nothing else out of 25,000 genes in our genome. So if there is a difference, we know what we can correlate that with. We know it's related to MC1R, the red hair gene, and not some other hidden genetic difference. Whereas in human populations that are not genetically identical, you have to play much more statistical analyses, and you can easily, and there are many, many examples where studies in humans that try to pin a behavior, let's say, to something like hair color or skin or many other variables, it may correlate, but it turned out that was not the cause. It was something else that you weren't really thinking of that turned out to be the cause. So in the mice, we had much more genetic rigor, and that made a big advantage.
Okay. You've answered so many questions. I think you're brilliant. Stephanie and I both were like blown away by your background. So you've answered a lot for just like the redhead community about our pain, our threshold, and really cleared up a lot of misinformation about this topic. And we did want to talk to you about melanoma and skin cancer more prevalent in redheads, but that might be a whole other discussion because we don't want to take up too much of your time. But we are so excited to finally know the truth. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I can tell you, melanoma is a very, very important topic, very dear to my heart, something that we've studied. There's a lot of progress in that. So the most important thing I can say is for people with red hair and very light skin, it's critically important to be careful for the sun, and even beyond being careful for the sun, to have their skin checked, be very mindful of changes that are happening in the skin. Because it is a largely, though not entirely, preventable form of skin cancer, and It can be a really scary form, as you know. So do be super cautious about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom and your work. We thank you so much for coming on. Okay.
My pleasure. Good talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we are less sensitive to pain.
Yes, it's confirmed that we are less sensitive to pain, and redheads feel less pain.
Right.
Because of two reasons, because of the MC1R gene and because of our pigment cells. So those two things together make us feel less pain. Now, he said the reason why a lot of people think that we feel... Okay, so it's kind of confusing, right? So we feel less pain.
Right. So it will help.
So let's use an example. Let's say we stub our toe.
Well, they only tested temperature and pressure.
Okay.
So let's say we put our hand, not that you're going to put on a hot plate.
On a hot plate.
Someone might go, ooh, like right away. We might go, ooh.
Yeah. Right.
And then pressure is like the example he gave with pricking the mouse or the mice.
Yeah. Getting pricked.
Is pressure.
Yeah. Right.
And it took a few times. Remember, they tried it once and it didn't lift its foot up or whatever. And then they tried it again and again, or with the sturdier, he said.
Yeah.
And then they picked it up. So maybe for like a brown or a black mouse, the first time they would have lifted its foot up.
Right.
So for pressure in the everyday world, when do you get pressured? Like if someone pinches you?
I don't know, maybe when you get a needle. That's kind of pressure, like, don't you think?
That's a prick. Yeah.
It's a prick. I mean, if you have to prick your finger, like, have you ever had to prick your finger? Like, I have to, because like my low blood sugar, like you're going to feel that less. So if you feel that less, you have a higher threshold of pain.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are getting confused because you feel less pain, but that means that you have a higher threshold for pain.
Right.
So when people see the less and the higher, and I really think a lot of articles online are not correct. Like, they're not reading it correctly.
No, they're not. The titles, when I was doing research before this podcast, misleading. Yeah, and when we did the editorial article, which maybe we should go back and, we'll change that up once this episode, now that we've aired. But it makes total sense now. He really simplified it. We hope to have him on for part 2, talking about melanoma, and, that topic in general is something that,
like he said, it's near and dear to his heart, and the topic.
Exactly. And it's something that we cover and have covered a lot in the past. And I think that it will be very important and beneficial to every redhead listening. Wouldn't you agree, Adrian, about knowing that, the importance of wearing sunscreen and staying sun protected and getting those freckles and moles and getting skin checks is imperative.
Yeah. It's really everything.
I feel like I kind of just went took a class.
Me too. I was like taking all these notes because I wanted to make sure that I was really following along and answering and asking the right questions. But I mean, I wasn't sure in the beginning, like when he was talking about the mice, I was so interested to know how that reflects on humans. And he did answer that. He said that there's already been studies done with humans. So the mice are just an added studies. Now, what I do find interesting too, and what I know will happen, even though we didn't ask him, is there's definitely going to be more studies in the future regarding this topic. I mean, it seems like it's something that is very important for doctors to understand when prescribing redheads pain medication. Because if we feel the pain less, then the medicine will have to be different that's given to us. And he did talk about that. So that is really what's super interesting, is understanding how the doctors are then going to prescribe redheads pain medication.
I know, because he mentioned,
right?
I totally, I mean, we didn't go into detail about like dentist, but I'm sure that has something to do with pain.
Right. Yeah. And there have been a lot of posts about how redheads feel more pain at the dentist, but according to his studies, redheads would feel less pain at the dentist. Yeah. Because there is pressure and there is temperature changes in your mouth, right? Or like when you're getting a cleaning.
Yeah.
So in fact, it seems like the dentist would be less painful for a redhead.
Right.
Now, how you take in, like if they give you Novocaine or something, that's a completely different topic, because they're going to give you your dose based on, if the doctor knows about the study, based on your red hair. So I got the impression that it's still like developing, but it seems like he is very confident that redheads feel less pain.
Yeah.
So anyway, this has been really interesting stuff. We were really nervous for this podcast because, we can talk about skincare and beauty.
Yeah, but when it comes to science and stuff, but he really led the way with this interview and, like we said, really simplified it and made Adrian and I understand, and hopefully you guys understand. Yeah. We hope we have him on again. So, and want to help us spread the news about the How to Be a Redhead brand in this podcast? Please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends, redheads, and everyone else to subscribe. You can listen to this podcast directly on howtobearedhead.com, on Spotify, Apple iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to look at the podcast notes to find links with products mentioned in this case, notes about what Dr. Fisher has said, and links
we'll do lots of posts about it.
Yeah, and links to his studies and so much more.
Rock it like a
redhead.